Hello everybody, I'm David Schuetz. I'm a senior consultant with NCC Group, where I mostly do web testing and iOS app testing and some basic research and fun things like that. I've also got allergies, and the allergies might be turning into a cold. And I notice there's no microphone up here, so I'm going to be trying to speak loud. If by the end of the talk I sound like I'm coughing up a lung, it's because I probably am. But hopefully we won't get to that. So we're here to talk about iOS crypto and why it's important. And why are we even thinking about this? Well, a couple of years ago, which now almost seems like ancient history, Apple made a very public stance where they said, we like your privacy, we value your privacy. They made some changes in iOS. They had a series of pages where they talked about it in great detail about what they're doing and why they're doing it, why they think it's important. And it had some lines in there that raised a lot of questions. Things like, we can't bypass your passcode. It's not technically feasible anymore to respond to warrants. This got a lot of people kind of upset, started asking lots of questions, things like, what does this really mean? What about forensic attacks? And it's interesting because this wasn't really the first time this was starting to hit the popular press. In May of 2013, so almost 18 months before Apple had even said that, CNET had an article about how Apple was deluged by police demands to do crypto. And they were even coming forth with stories and ideas and anecdotes and things that weren't really supported because, of course, Apple wasn't talking about it. But they talked about there being a big backlog of cases, up to even 7 weeks. One case took 4 months to work on. And then, you know, this even went into, there's a case in Kentucky, there's all the cases that have been happening in New York, one of which just got resolved yesterday, in fact. There's the San Bernardino case recently. So all kinds of cases and issues where people are talking about Apple encrypting things, but they were never really clear about what they could or couldn't do. The fact that all these articles talk about a backlog makes you sort of think, okay, well, obviously there's no magic key. They can't just simply plug a phone into something and boom, they've got all the data. They could brute force the passwords. Okay, well, Apple, they're rich. They can afford an awful lot of GPU crackers. Surely they can make it go quickly. It doesn't work that way. And that's what I'm here to talk about, is how does it actually work? Why can't you crack your passcode offline? And lots of other details. iOS encryption is very complex, but it's also fairly straightforward, and it's very comprehensive. Some early details were figured out some time ago by researchers. There's a really good talk that I'll reference at the end from Sojeti, and I think it was at Hack in the Box, Amsterdam, perhaps. I don't remember. Anyway, it's in the notes at the very end. They published an awful lot of very good details way back for iOS 4. They did this by reverse engineering, breaking some stuff, looking at published APIs. And then in May 2012, Apple kind of put their cards on the table, and they started publishing an iOS security white paper, which is a fantastic document. It doesn't go into code-level detail, but it gives very good information about how encryption works, Apple Pay, Touch ID, all kinds of information, all about the deep guts of security on iOS devices. So definitely check those out if you like this stuff. So let's talk about encryption. That's iOS encryption. Okay, next slide. Originally, when the iPhones came out, the first couple iPhones didn't have much data protection on them. It was very simple to get data off of them. People were making fun of it. You could hook it up to USB and suck all kinds of information off of it. In iPhone 3GS, they added a dedicated AES coprocessor located directly between the CPU and disk. I think it's actually on the system on a chip. And so basically, you can't get data in or out of the CPU without it going through this encryption step. And they generate a random key, they call it the EMF key, and that key is then encrypted using another key, and I'll explain all this as we go through, and then it's stored in a special area, and this key is used to encrypt the disk. I've seen conflicting documentation on this. Sometimes I've seen it say it encrypts the whole disk as a disk. Sometimes I've seen where it says it just encrypts the file system metadata, so it might be possible to read out the file system structure, but you can't actually read any of the inodes. I'm not sure which is which. I haven't actually looked at the encrypted data to see. But the basic approach is the same. You're basically encrypting the disk. So again, there's this UID which is burned in the hardware. It's burned in the system on a chip. We don't know whether it's burned in when the device is manufactured or perhaps when it first powers up. It might create a random ID and fuse itself into a ROM or a PROM essentially on the chip. But it's a long code that's unique to that device. No other device in the world should have a matching code. If you do, go play the lottery. That is then used to encrypt a consistent string. I don't remember what the strings are, but there's different strings like all ones or just a fixed string is encrypted to create this key 89V. Then you create a random password, the EMF password, encrypted with 89V, and store that in what's called effaceable storage. And then that key is what's used to encrypt the partition. The big advantage of this is a fast wipe, and that's, I think, is what Apple has said is the main reason they even created it in the first place, was so that you could wipe a device instantly. If you want to turn over a computer or something like that and give it to somebody else, and you don't feel like taking the hard drive out and smashing it with a sledgehammer, you would do a disk wipe, but that can take a long time to go through the whole disk, all the files, and scrub everything. With this, it's literally just erase a key, and the disk is basically wiped. I mean, the data's still there, but it's encrypted with 256-bit AES, so it's, as far as we know today, inaccessible. It also means that you can't directly modify the data on the device, on the chip, so you can't just simply pull the chip out, put something on it and write to the memory, or you can't pull the chips out and move them into a different device and read the data there. There are some limitations, though. As soon as you get into the system, you've got access to anything, because it's basically a transparent full disk encryption. There's no password attached to it or anything like that. It just kind of ties the device to the memory and gives you that fast wipe capability. So in iOS 4, the next year, they introduced the Data Protection API. And what this does is for every single file, they create a random file key and then encrypt the file with that key. And then that file key is itself encrypted with a class key. So all the files are encrypted with their own keys, but all those individual keys are encrypted with sort of a global key that you can use to then get to the files. Again, a lot easier with a diagram. You have your data file, and then inside the data file, there's metadata and there's the actual data of the file. The file data is encrypted by the file key is encrypted by a class key. And there are multiple classes. We'll start with the table at the bottom. File protection, the protection class none, there's no additional encryption. The only encryption that's on the file is what's provided as a byproduct of the full disk encryption. Complete unless open is a special mode where it's always locked except when you can actually have it's complicated. There's actually an asymmetric key that's used so you can write to the file when the device is locked. So if you're like downloading something large over the net and you want to be able to have that secure when it's finished downloading, you can use this and be confident that when the device locks, it can still write to the file, but somebody couldn't read it. There's complete until first user authentication, and basically what that means is all those files are encrypted. Well, they're all encrypted, but all those files are unavailable after reboot until the first time you unlock the phone. So the class key to decrypt those is not available in memory once you reboot the phone. Once you've unlocked it once, then that class key is available, and you can keep reading that file even with the device that's locked. And then there's file system complete, which means that as soon as you lock the device, that file is no longer accessible. The class key that decrypts complete file protection complete files, that class key is dropped from memory as soon as you lock the device. Now, the default encryption when in iOS 4 through 6 was no protection. So if you have an application, you write a file to disk, it's just written out, just normal plain, no additional protection. Starting with iOS 7 through the present day, it's complete until first authentication. So now, if you write an application, you save data to the disk, as soon as that device is rebooted, your data won't be readable until the user unlocks the phone at least once. And applications can add further encryption to that. They can always go to file protection complete. I think the reason Apple chose this mode as the default is because there are some applications that might receive updates in the background and things like that. They might need to write to stuff, and if they're chosen the file protection complete by default, that's not going to work. It's just going to add some issues to the developers to try and parse out problems with that. So they chose sort of a middle ground compromise just for the ease of implementation for the time being. And then most system apps, up until iOS 7, up until including iOS 7, used none. So most of the data that even the Apple applications kind of did the same thing. They still wrote to disk, and they were still using the default protection of none. So I mentioned the different class keys. So again, you've got files with file keys that are encrypted by class keys. There's multiple classes. You saw the 4 file protection complete or file protection classes on the previous slide. There's a similar number of protections for keychain items. Protect until first authentication, protect always, things like that. And for example, that's why if you reboot your phone, it can't connect to your Wi-Fi, because the keychain entry that contains the password for the Wi-Fi is encrypted with complete until first unlock. Once you've unlocked it, then you can read it, you can connect to the Wi-Fi. When you lock the device again and you leave the house and you come back and it's still locked, it can still read that key because you haven't rebooted the phone. That key is still in memory. So the data protection none, it's also the class 4 or class D. And basically what happens is it generates a random key, encrypts that with another one of these magical keys derived from the UID, and then stores that in the effaceable storage as well. So now the diagram is looking a lot more complicated. You've got your hardware-based UID stored in the system on a chip. That's used to derive 2 sort of intermediate magic keys that are then used to encrypt the disk encryption key and the default protection key, which gets stored there in class 4 key. And then that thing at the bottom is the key bag. So each class key is wrapped in the key bag. So remember, before we had the file is encrypted by the file key is encrypted by the class key. Now the class keys are encrypted in the key bag using the user's passcode key. And then the entire key bag is itself also encrypted using another key that's stored in effaceable storage. When you change a passcode, it deletes all the old keys. We'll go into some of that a little bit in another slide. So now we've got the whole diagram. You have all the data being stored on the right, wrapped, encrypted with the various class keys that are stored in the key bag. The class keys are encrypted by another passcode key. The passcode key is derived from the UID and the passcode, and also that key 835. So the only way that you can create the passcode key that unwraps all the other keys is by using that UID that's stored on the device and that you can't extract. This is why you can't take the password offline and try and crack it on a GPU cracker. The key derivation function that they use is a PBKDF2 using the passcode. The UID is solved in some variable number of iterations. The number of iterations depends on the device. The slower device uses fewer iterations, and the faster device uses a lot more. Their target is about 80 milliseconds per attempt. So the idea is that 4-character password, 4-digit passcode would take about 20 minutes to brute force. And that's been constant pretty much since they've done this. On the A7 chips and forward, they added a 5-second delay, which we believe is implemented in the Secure Enclave, which again we'll discuss later. We're not 100% positive how exactly that works. Sometimes, as I said, the iOS security doc that Apple provides is really good. Sometimes it just gives you enough to ask more questions. But again, the passcode depends on the key derived from the passcode depends on the UID, so you can't pull it from your phone, you can't crack it on your cluster. Just mention a little bit of this, brute forcing a passcode. If you want to do that, you have to do it on the device. So you have to have some way to get to a shell on the device that has access to certain parts of the system, and then you can run a script or a program that will brute force it. We used to be able to do this, to just people like us, because there used to be a boot ROM bug that would let us boot an untrusted image, and then there were utilities out there that we could crack it. That's how we know it takes about 20 minutes for a 4-digit password. Haven't been able to do that for some years now. Again, it's about 80 milliseconds per attempt, but the 5-second delay that they've added now means you multiply by about 62, which is great until you think about the fact that it takes a 6-digit passcode from a day to 2 months. 2 months seems like a long time, and it is a long time to have a little robot sitting there punching buttons, but it's still certainly something that the law enforcement community or a hostile government, they'd be happy to spend that time. Or even a hostile corporate enemy, competitor. Competitor is the word I was looking for. There's also an attempt escalation and auto wipe, but as far as I understand, those are part of the UI. So really what's happening is the UI kind of says, okay, here's a passcode, is it right? It's not right? Okay. Then the next time you got to wait 10 seconds to enter it again, you got to wait a minute, you got to wait 15 minutes, and you have to wait an hour. And then after 10 incorrect passcodes, it'll wipe the device. But the choice to determine whether or not you do that is a user choice. It's a preference that can be set in the UI. So the UI still has a little bit of control over how this works. When you boot from an external image, there's no limits. So you can just keep trying and trying as much as you can. So when you lock the device, I mentioned a little bit about this before, the file protection complete key is removed from RAM, which means any file that's encrypted with that file protection complete file is now no longer readable. So as soon as you lock the device, you can't read those files. And you can see this if you're on a jailbroken device. You can be shelled in, you can cat a file, you read a cat file, you read it, hit the lock button, cat a file, and you actually get a disk error. So you can't read it as soon as you lock it. It takes a second or two, but it pretty much happens right away. The other keys remain present in memory, which gives you the access to Wi-Fi and certain other features. Lets you see the contact information when your phone rings. There was an odd edge case that I found where this didn't happen some time ago, where if you unlock the phone using an MDM command to unlock it, and then entered a new passcode because you're a good corporate doobie, and you say, okay, I'm going to enter my new passcode, and then lock it, it didn't actually delete the key bag from memory, so you could still access the files if you could get into the device. As soon as you unlocked it, relocked it again, it was done. So that was just a very strange, very rare bug. But it shows that sometimes there may be, they're still relying on certain amounts of the OS for some of these protections. If you change your passcode, and this is another reason for the way they've got this hierarchy, if you change the password, it only needs to change the keys that are stored in the key bag. And it's actually not even changing the keys, it's changing the encrypted parts of the keys, it's re-racking it. So it duplicates the key bag. Because it's unlocked, it has access to all the contents, all the class keys in a decrypted form. It wraps them with your new passcode key, and then re-encrypts the key bag with a new bag key, throws everything else away. If they weren't using this sort of structure, then you might actually have to go through and either re-encrypt all the individual file keys or re-encrypt all the individual files. Obviously that wouldn't work. This way it's a very fast operation to change your passcode. It just changes the data in the key bag and everything else on the system remains intact. When you reboot, it's an awful lot like when you lock the device. You obviously lose the file protection complete key. You also lose the complete until first authentication key from memory, which means that even those things like, again, the Wi-Fi passwords you won't be able to get. So the only files that would be available after a reboot is anything that's listed as file protection none. And even then, they're still protected by full disk encryption. And then finally, if you wipe the device, the effaceable storage, I'm never sure how to pronounce that. The storage is wiped, and that destroys your D key, which means all the file protection none keys files are no longer readable. Destroys the bag key, which means you can't decrypt the key bag, and it also destroys the EMF key, which means you can't decrypt the file system anyway. So when you hit wipe, it really wipes. You're just not going to get the data. So a quick recap. You have the file. The file is encrypted with a file key. The file key is encrypted with a class key. The class key is then stored in the key bag, and that's encrypted using a passcode that's derived from your UID, your passcode, and the key 835 on the system. The entire key bag is then also encrypted with a bag 1 key that's stored in effaceable storage. And then the EMF key and all these other keys are eventually derived from the UID, which is burned into the chip and inaccessible outside the device. It's not even accessible to software inside the device. Basically, you give code to the system, and it says, here it is. Here's the result of the operation using UID, but you never get to see the UID. All right, so is this perfect? It's not perfect. There are still ways around things. Jailbreaking devices gets you access to certain things that you wouldn't be able to do otherwise. There's obviously the potential for bugs in the software, some simple, some complex. Forensics tools can get a certain amounts of data, special things you can do at the boot level, and then of course you can just skip the phone and go straight to the cloud. So we'll talk about all these here. Jailbreaking, of course, it's exploiting bugs in the operating system. You're hacking your phone. And nowadays you're hacking your phone using something that came from hackers overseas, which may or may not be a good thing. I'm obviously a very US-centric view, but yes, you're hacking your phone with people from China. That's the way it is these days. I guess it used to be Canadians or Germans, but now it's Chinese. At any rate, you're trusting some person you don't know to run an exploit on your phone and hack it so you can do things that degrade the security, and you're also degrading your security by letting a hacker hack your phone in the first place. So, good idea, bad idea, I don't know. I used to run a jailbroken phone for a long time because I was on T-Mobile and they didn't support T-Mobile yet. But now I only use jailbreaking for research. And what it does when you jailbreak, it bypasses your code signing, bypasses the sandboxes to protect data from being read by different applications. And it obviously needs to modify the file system in order to be persistent so that the jailbreak will still be there when you reboot the phone. But the jailbreaking process, the actual act of jailbreaking, can't bypass the crypto on a locked device. So we always hear a lot of people saying, hey, well, of course you can just break through the phone. Teenagers have been doing jailbreaks for years. But that's not the same thing. Once the phone's locked, you've got all these very strong crypto protections that you need to get past in order to do anything. Usually when you're jailbreaking, you have to unlock the device, install stuff, reboot the device, sometimes reboot 2 or 3 different times. All those things involve the crypto that the jailbreak is going to be able to get past while it's, before it's done. And remember that when you're jailbreaking, there's a much larger attack surface. Any app or service that's running on the phone is a potential endpoint for a vulnerability, for a code execution attack, for anything like that that will let you get into it. When the phone's locked, there's much less surface for you to attack. So what about bugs? This is the other thing I always hear about is people say, well, look at that lock screen bypass that just showed up. You can do this crazy thing and call Siri, and now you can read their contacts. Well, really what your lock screen bypasses are doing is they're moving from one app to another. You're not actually unlocking the phone. The crypto is still in place. It's still locked, per se. But instead of displaying the lock screen app, now you're displaying the contacts app, or you're displaying the messages app. So certain things you can bounce back and forth between there, and that's by design. You know, on the iOS now, you can swipe up from the bottom and launch the camera. So you can run different apps while the lock screen is in place. These bypasses just sometimes let you go a little bit deeper into those apps. But you're still limited in what data you can see. The data that you see still has to be available when the device is locked. And so if even if you get out to a springboard and are able to launch another app, which I don't think there's been a lock screen that lets you do that yet, even if you could, if that app used file protection complete, you wouldn't be able to read any of that data either. And then, of course, these are usually fixed pretty quickly by Apple. There's also the potential for malicious apps, either coming from the App Store, which sometimes sneak by, or nowadays you're seeing a lot more people side-loading apps. They find ways to get cracked apps and wrap it with an enterprise cert to install on your phone. You don't need the App Store. Sometimes those can have bugs in them or exploits in them that attack bugs. And there's always the potential for other OS level problems that we're not really thinking about or haven't seen much of yet. There's also forensic capabilities, but there's no real magic channel for forensics. You can't just simply plug something in and it automatically finds everything. A lot of times they're using the same bugs that we already know about in the community. The tricks that they use, the methods that they use aren't really well discussed. And a lot of times even the capabilities are sometimes kind of vaguely defined on the web page. So it's like, it says, oh, we can do this. And you scroll down, all these features, these things only apply to this phone. So there are certain features there that are good, some that are hard to really understand whether they're there or not. But ultimately, if you have a locked device, these tools still face the same obstacles that you and I will. If the phone is locked, but the crypto is still in place, then these things still can't get at them. If it's an unlocked device, then yeah, there are some hidden or little understood features that allow you to get certain access from the device, and once they can get certain databases, they can pull off all kinds of things, all kinds of photo information, things that you think are deleted but are still kind of still hidden in system databases, stuff like that. So there is a treasure trove of information when the device is unlocked. When it's locked, there's very little that they can get off. And then booting a new OS. You know, for a regular computer, you hook up a USB drive to the outside, you reboot coming off of that, or a CD-ROM or something like that. You boot a different OS, now you can attack the file system. The way that boots work on iOS devices is they have multiple stages. There's the low-level boot, which starts off, that's stored in the boot ROM. That starts up another process called iBoot, and it checks the signature before it starts it. So if the signature of the iBoot image doesn't match an appropriate signature with a CA chain that goes back to Apple, then it won't boot. And then once iBoot runs, it loads the kernel and actually boots the OS and does similar signature checks. And the OS image, when you install it from Apple, so if you download an update, the operating system image is also encrypted using a key that's unique to each kind of device. It's called the GID key. And just like the UID, it's burned into the silicon when they create the device. So if you can figure out what the GID is for an iPhone 6, then you can decrypt iPhone 6 firmwares. But if you can't get that code, then you can't decrypt that firmware. And then there were some bugs on early devices. They fixed it in the iPhone 4S, but up till iPhone 4 and iPad 1, there was a bug in the boot ROM that allowed you to boot an untrusted, unsigned image. Basically, there was just a way to screw with the signature validation process, and it skipped right over, and you could boot the image. And that's how we were able to, in the past, boot off an external image, get to a shell, and actually run past code cracks. It was using that. But that hasn't worked since, I can never remember what the years are, but 4 or 5 years now. And then, of course, there's the cloud. Many apps now have server-side data components. Most of the apps that I check for my job, most of the data is online. Most frequently, they're just very thin veneers of apps. A lot of times, it's just a web app, sort of in a window in an application. And all the data is stored up on a server. Recently, Apple started providing some basic app data storage for free. So if you're a developer and you have an app, you have a certain amount of data that your app can just store on iCloud for no cost or very little cost. Of course, users can have their own iCloud accounts where they can store lots of information, all their iWork apps and stuff like that. Third-party storage, and then, of course, the applications themselves might have their own back-end service that they connect to. So if you can't unlock the phone, just go to the net. And then finally, MDM and syncing. When you sync a device to iTunes, all the data is obviously synced to iTunes, especially if you do an actual backup. So your calendar, your contacts, your application data, all that stuff gets stored on the device. And you can read that unless you've encrypted the data. If you've encrypted the backup, then there's another encryption step that's difficult to get past that you now need to go through in order to read that backup data. Also, the most sensitive information on the device, the keychain, isn't backed up to the desktop unless you're using encrypted backups. It used to be also that you could take the pairing record off of a desktop, move it to another desktop, and then read that person's phone. So if you had an office mate that always left their computer unlocked, or if you were in a environment where you shared computers, you could log into their computer anyway as yourself, get to where the pairing records were stored, take that off, copy it to your machine. Then the next time he leaves his phone lying on the desk when he goes out to lunch, you just hook it up and pull up a free software that you can pull down off the internet and read almost all the data that's in all of his apps, because now that phone trusts your computer, you can get at the data. In iOS 8, I believe it was, they actually closed a lot of these holes. So now you can't simply use these free or low-cost software. It was like things like iExplorer and stuff like that. You can't use those to navigate the whole file system. You can only navigate to certain folders on certain applications, which is great for users, lousy for me. But that's what it is. And then mobile device management, MDM. If a phone is enrolled and configured appropriately, you can unlock a device remotely. You can send a signal from the MDM server to the device. It sees it, it says okay, and it unlocks. It actually wipes the key out, so now the key bag is wide open, and then you can no longer lock it with a password. But to do that, you obviously need to be able to talk to the device. You need Wi-Fi or cellular access. If the phone's been rebooted, there's no Wi-Fi. If the phone doesn't have a data plan activated, then there's no cellular data and you can't get to it. If it's an iPod Touch or an iPad without cellular data, then again, you can't access it on MDM. So it's a great way to do it if you've got access to it, but you have to have an active network connection in order to send that command. So that's how we got to where we are. Now, it's been getting a lot more attention lately. This used to be pretty arcane, pretty much of interest to geeks like us, people in the security community. Why has this been a big deal now since it's been so stable since iOS 4? And really there's three things that have been changing in the last couple of years. There have been some changes to software, some changes to hardware, and a very public change to their policy on privacy. And a lot of this was probably driven by some of what happened after the Snowden revelations. So in iOS 7, I mentioned before that the default for applications was none. And then starting with iOS 7, the third-party apps was complete until first unlock. Starting with iOS 8 moving forward, all apps are now defaulting to first unlock for the system as well as for third-party generated apps, which means that most data on the system is not going to be readable immediately after you reboot the phone. And that becomes important in a little while. They also limited the sandbox access over USB. That's what I was just saying about even from a trusted computer over USB, you can't access all the files for each app. So these were the software changes that came out over the last, between 2014 and 2015. And there's a good way to demonstrate this for yourself. Even if you had an iOS 7 phone still at the time, can't really do it now because very few people are probably still on that. But you can reboot, call yourself from a landline, and you'd see your contact information show up with your name, maybe your picture, stuff like that. With an iOS 8 or 9 phone, after a fresh reboot, when you call it, you just see the phone number, no information at all. As soon as you unlock it and relock it, now the contacts database is open, call again and you'll see the whole thing, the name of the picture and so on. So that's why if you've ever wondered why sometimes you see a phone number and sometimes you see details, it's because you probably just rebooted the phone. And then they added some hardware changes. In 2013 with iPhone 5S, they added the Secure Enclave, which is a special subprocessor running a hardened OS. It's an L4 micro OS. And it also uses a specially encrypted area on the disk using, again, the UID to encrypt the data. The documentation from Apple says it's also entangled with an anti-replay counter. So they've got some additional crypto protections on the data from the Secure Enclave. And the Enclave handles many of the passcode features. We don't know for certain whether the failure count is stored there or if it's stored on the disk. And they also have a 5-second delay to password attempts. And they've also added some additional features over time to the Enclave. For example, you can now ask the Secure Enclave to encrypt something for you using a key that you don't get to see. So you can actually say, give me a public-private key pair. It gives you the public. It keeps the private hidden. You never even see the private key. Even the app that asks for it never gets to see the private key. Not many people are using that. There's an app that just came out recently that demonstrates it. But it's kind of a nice little feature that they're working on. But in general, the Secure Enclave, we only know a little bit about it. People haven't done a whole lot of digging, though there is a talk, I believe, at Black Hat this summer that's going to be on that, so I'm definitely going to be watching that to see what they say. And then finally, there's the Apple drawing the line in the sand. They came right out and said very clearly, we sell products, not your data. They want customers to be in control of their own information, and there's actually pages up there which give some pretty good technical advice for security choices, talking about using long passcodes, two-factor authentication, Touch ID, all kinds of really good advice aimed at just normal, everyday people for making your phone even more secure. And then finally, they also promised additional transparency about government access. So all these things lead us to where we are today. We've had a gradual security of improvements in security over a number of years. And then we had Snowden saying, oh, look, the government's reading all your stuff. May or may not be true, I'm not going into that. But Snowden happened, everybody got upset, and it really started a lot of focus on this, which is good. Focus is good. Apple drew their line in the sand, saying that they're committed to your privacy. We started to see some public pushback, public and I presume private pushback from law enforcement. Then there was the attack in San Bernardino and FBI requesting the court to make Apple unlock the phone. And that led us to where I was in New York the other day, and somebody found out, I was sitting at a table, and somebody found out, was chatting with me, found out I worked in security. One of the first things they said is, what do you think about the FBI Apple thing? So a complete stranger asking me about this, and I thought that was fantastic. Even better, they were squarely on the side of Apple, so I was very happy to see that. So what FBI asked for, and everybody here probably knows a lot about this, but just we'll recap. FBI had asked for a way to bypass the passcode guessing limits. So they wanted to be able to take the phone and just enter passcodes over and over and over again to be able to brute force it. In order to do that, the order from the court was specifically asking for a custom version of the operating system tailored to just this phone. Was it possible to do this? Probably. I mean, like I said, we were doing this as hackers for years using the older phones with a boot ROM bug. There's no reason to believe that Apple didn't have the capability technically to do this. But Apple also spent nearly 100 pages in court responses detailing why it was a bad idea. And they made a pretty good argument, I think. And then eventually the FBI said, we don't need you. We hired somebody to do it for us, and we're good. So how did they finally get in? Don't know. We've talked about a lot of possibilities, and certainly everybody on the blogosphere, and the Twitter sphere, and everywhere else, and CNN, they've thrown out ideas, and oh, this company's doing it. Oh, no, is this company will cost $1 million? Nobody really knows. There's some good ideas, there's some crazy ideas. What we do know is that there are definitely some attack surfaces that's still present in the phone. Obviously, the whole system depends on cryptography. It's extensive, it's comprehensive, it's through every bit of the phone. All the security basically assumes that that's safe. And then there's hardware attacks. Ultimately, if you can hold it, you can own it. There's nothing that you can do to prevent that fact. The question is, how much do you want to spend? Because the deep hardware attacks are possible, but they can be expensive and risky. And then finally, of course, there are software bugs. They happen to everybody. They happen a lot. Every iOS update, there's some weird bug that goes up, lock screen bypasses, or there's been a couple that actually let you interrupt the passcode process. And I'll actually describe those in a minute. I'm getting ahead of myself. So cryptographic attacks. If you want to boot a hacked image, so again, boot off an external disk so you can actually run brute force passcode and cracking on the device. You could break into Apple and steal their secret key, so now you can sign your own image. That's the best way to do it. We don't know how they store those secret keys. The iOS security document mentions that they use tamper-resistant HSMs for the private keys for certain other facilities, certain other capabilities. Pretty reasonable to assume that the signing key for their OS on their most popular products is probably also protected by an HSM, so you're probably not going to be able to do that, I would hope. You could break the signature process. You could break RSA. You could break SHA-1. You could find a boot ROM bug. Okay, the first two probably aren't going to happen. Again, I hope not. The boot ROM bug, it could be there, but also we know that that's kind of the holy grail for jailbreakers, so if there's one there, we're not seeing it. And obviously the jailbreak community isn't perfect, but they're probably look pretty hard with every new device to see if there's any kind of way around that. And then of course there's the possibility of a complete cryptographic break in AES, which would allow you to either derive the UID and thus assign, start an offline browser, or just allow you to directly read the files anyway. That would obviously be very, very bad. There are some hardware attacks. You could take the system on a chip, take off the top, scan it, take off a little bit more, scan it, using chemicals and lasers and I don't know what else, X-rays. Eventually find where the UID is stored and directly extract it. So now you need this code, let's just get the code. Now that you've got it, you make a copy of the NAND onto your normal computer, and then you brute force the password on a GPU cluster. It's possible, it's also risky and expensive. If you break it, you're screwed. If your laser is tuned a little bit too high or a little bit off to the side and it wipes out the UID, you're never going to get the data back out because it's gone. There's also potential for memory chip attacks. If you can find a way to prevent the failure from being written to disk, then the OS will never know that you just entered a bad passcode. You can find a way maybe to roll the flash back, so you enter 5 passcodes and you turn the machine off, roll a copy of the flash back into memory, turn it back on again, it's back to 0. How about that? Haven't been proven that that's possible. It's certainly theoretically possible. I think that'd be great black hat talk, but I'm not going to do that one. But I'd love to see somebody do that. That'd be very interesting. And then there's the possibility for some kind of race condition. If at a hardware level there's some kind of signal made, deliberate or inadvertent, a side effect, but if there's some kind of signal that lets you know the passcode was good or the passcode was bad, then you might be able to shut the device down as soon as that passcode was bad signal is found before it writes it out to disk, and now you've just bypassed the failure count. Of course, now you've turned an 80 millisecond per try thing into a 2 minute per try thing, but still it's possible. You might be able to find the same race condition in software. There's actually a bug a year or two ago where there was some kind of a visual indication on the screen that the passcode was bad, and they actually had a little robot that would tap away the things and a little camera in one spot on the screen, and as soon as the bad password was entered, the camera would discover this little indication and immediately power the phone down, then you power it back up again. So again, it really slowed the attack process down, but it avoided ever writing the failures out to disk, so you could just do it as often as you wanted if you had the time. And that's been fixed. We've mentioned lock screen bypasses don't get you much data. They might show the springboard. They might be able to show that the phone didn't have anything on it anyway. If you were able to find a lock screen bypass that gets to the main springboard and you look at it and you're like, these are all just the stock apps. There's not a single third-party app on here that I care about, and I look in the contacts folder and it's got Apple. Then you know the guy never used the phone at all and there's probably nothing on it. There's also a possibility for code injections, attacks in the device firmware update or iTunes restore, wired or wireless attack surface. There's a lot of things that you might be able to go and do work against. The most likely suspects, in my opinion, either a boot ROM bug, so you can then boot a hacked image and crack the password, a lock screen bypass that might get you some intel and maybe enough to say, it's not worth it. That probably wasn't worth $1 million though, so that's probably not what they did. There might be other bugs in the lock screen that allow you to intercept the passcode failure count. And then, of course, there's the possibility for hardware-level attacks on memory. I think any of these are reasonable and achievable. Whether any of these are the thing or if there's something we can't even conceive of, we won't know probably for a while. So how much could you get? If you want everything off the phone right away, you need a major crypto bug. If you want everything on the phone eventually, you need some way to interrupt the passcode failure tracking and using some kind of hardware software attacks, but you've got to brute force it, so that could take a while. If you want just simple general intel, lock screen bypass. So what does this mean for you and me? Well, again, there's really good advice on Apple's privacy pages. Terrific information about what to do, how to secure it, good best practices, two-factor authentication. Buy newer devices with a secure enclave because that's definitely has additional protections, and I'm fairly sure that Apple's going to improve that protection over time, especially with what's been happening lately. Right now, the best advice is select a long passcode. Even with the 5-second delay in secure enclave, you saw a numeric-only passcode at 6 digits. It could still be cracked in 2 months. So an alphanumeric passcode is best. My kids even have alphanumeric passcodes because they're strange. But that's probably the best way to do this for now, which gets around issues of the only really easy attack vector, which is Apple booting off of a trusted boot image. If you use a long passcode, you can always use Touch ID for your daily use, but don't use it so often that you don't forget your passcode. On the other hand, Touch ID always seems to screw up for me every couple of days anyway, so I still remember the passcode. And of course, if you're arrested, turn off your phone right away. And if you have a chance, try to unlock it 3 or 4 times with your pinky so that it will screw up the fingerprint and it'll no longer accept the fingerprint. I'm sure you'll hear more about that in the keynote from somebody who can actually talk about legal things, because I can't. So from the first version of this talk I gave in 2014, I had a few questions that weren't answered yet. Can Apple brute force the passcodes? We always kind of figured they could. We still don't really know, but we suspect very strongly that they could. Would they? Seems like they don't want to. And could they be ordered to? We don't know. They tried to order them, didn't finish. And has this happened already? Who knows? It might have happened already. But there are still some legitimate questions we just don't have answers for. The docs didn't clearly describe where the crypto processor was, if it was in the system on chip or not. I'm pretty sure it is, because that's kind of a silly question. Can the secure enclave software be updated? That's really the biggest question about this, is aside from booting off of a secure trusted image, could you update the image in the secure enclave and override the passcode protections? And if you can do that, can you do it from a locked device? I would hope you can't, but we don't really know for certain. Are any of the secure enclave functions currently in ROM? Can they even be updated at all? Where's the failure count located? Is it on the flash, or is it somewhere inside the system on a chip? And then finally, will this secure enclave enforce a 10-try limit? If Apple can get to the point where the passcode failure count, all the passcode failure tracking and everything like that are all stored in SE, and they're all in ROM, so they can't be changed by Apple, and the 10-try limit is enforced by that ROM code, so there's no way to get around that. If all those are true, it might even be possible to be happy with a 4-digit passcode. I don't know, but we're not there yet. So the conclusion, as we all know, iOS security is very dependent upon the encryption. It's pervasive. Everything's built upon the presumption that that's strong and safe. It's complicated. It's comprehensive. As far as I know, there's no real well-known design flaws in this. Certainly, I haven't seen anybody say, oh, well, if they'd done this, it would be better, but they chose this algorithm, and so there's a problem. Haven't seen anything like that. Bypassing the protection, therefore, depends on breaking the passcode, which you can do with very expensive hardware attacks, you can do with software bugs that are kind of short-lived, and it's still a slow process, especially if you have a long passcode. Or you can just break crypto in general, which breaks everything in the world, and we're completely hosed. And so the best thing is just to fight back with a strong passcode. So I mentioned a couple references that the iOS security paper, they tend to update that in the fall usually, sometimes in the spring as well. Very good paper. Unfortunately, it's very generically named, so you'll eventually find it if you Google for it, and it's available at Apple. There's the Schuetz talk I mentioned from Hack in the Box Amsterdam in 2011, so that's 5 years ago now. And that goes into an awful lot of detail about how all this works. They were some of the first people to publicly describe a lot of this. And then there was also a talk from Elcomsoft at Black Hat Abu Dhabi, also 2011, that kind of talks a little bit about that as applied to iPhone 5S or iOS 5. I think the Hack in the Box style design was for. So those are all good papers. Really, the security paper is the canonical document. The other two kind of give you some background, a little bit more technical understanding, because the paper can be confusing. So that's it. Thank you for your time, and we've got a couple minutes for questions. Yes?
Is the iOS kernel also encrypted on the disk, or at what point can we just execute that code?
The question was, is the iOS kernel, is the OS in general encrypted as well, and at what point does that get decrypted? There's a lot of additional nuances and capabilities that I didn't really go into here. The disk is split into two partitions, a system partition and a data partition. The EMFP described talks about encrypting the data partition. The system partition, which has changed over time, I think currently it's a 2 gig partition, is itself encrypted using a different key, and that's also derived from UID and so on. And you had one? No? Anything else? Yes?
So after seeing a lot of the talks between FBI and Apple, it just seems like both sides, whether it's the government or the Justice Department and Apple, they're in their own bubble, right? So no one really wants to budge. And a lot of the arguments I've seen and heard about, let's just say the Justice Department side, is that, oh, what if it was your kid in San Bernardino? Would you want this to happen? Or, oh, what if it's a child, molester? Would you want them to get away with it if you have to on your iPhone? And then Apple obviously takes the side of we want to sell devices and technology, not your privacy. Is there a middle ground? And what I mean by that is definitely not key escrow, because crypto wars, both of them did not work out for the government's favor, but is there a middle ground that you can think of a strategy or anything like that to say okay, maybe we can work together? Because maybe I'm just very optimistic in humanity, but there's got to be a way, or there's got to be a solution out there to kind of find a middle ground between the two.
Yeah, so the question for the recording is, the Department of Justice and FBI and Apple in their own bubble, each side is intransigent. Is there a middle ground that allows you to have this capability to protect against kidnapped kids or child porn and yet not oppose everybody else's rights? And if there is a middle ground, and I knew it, I wouldn't be speaking cons like this, I'd be making a lot more money. I don't think there is. You mentioned key escrow. Key escrow was pretty well destroyed with the Clipper chip years ago, and they talk about it again. And really, key escrow depends on storing keys securely, and we've proven again and again and again, we can't do that. People will eventually break into things. Maybe things like HSM and stuff, there might be paths, but I'm not confident in that just based on our track record.
So do you think it'll depend on policy rather than technology?
I'd hate to see it become dependent on policy, because eventually policies will all default to governments have control. So unfortunately, this may be one of the situations where the tech just has to win because it's the safest approach. But that's all that's a political policy, legal question that I'm really not even remotely qualified to talk about, other than my opinion, which you can probably guess is more on the Apple side. Yes?
So I know it will be inconvenient for Apple, but let's say that phone was running the latest iteration of iOS 8, and Apple could say, okay, we can hack this, but then government wants Apple to hack this, but then they can immediately release a software patch for that specific method that they used. Would that be possible, feasible?
Could. So the question, it sounds like, if Apple were forced to use some kind of, not backdoor, some kind of weakness to break the passcode on a device, could they succumb to the acquiesce to the court order, do it, and then immediately issue a patch to protect everybody else? It depends on where that weakness was, what they were doing. If the weakness they exploited was, excuse me, if it was because of the boot image question, then they can't really patch that because they have to be able to boot. If it was because of some other things, then yeah, they might be able to change things. And again, with the possibilities I raised about the secure enclave, if the backoff code and the timeouts and stuff like that are stored in the secure enclave, but that code is modifiable, then yes, I could see them maybe being told, fix the secure enclave, or abuse the secure enclave so you can crack the passcode, and they say, okay, that's great. New phones now, it's in ROM, we can't change it ever. That might be a path that will happen. I don't know if they will or not. That's kind of where I would like to see it go. I only think about this part-time. So, all the way over there.
I believe there's another testimony recently in Congress about this issue. Maybe not explicit, but the general consensus kind of seemed to shift towards, well, let's just let each group play the role. Apple tries to secure their devices as much as they can, and we give the FBI, more resources so they can hire better hackers, and they just try to hack it as much as they can. Cat and mouse.
Yeah.
What do you feel about that situation?
What do I feel about the idea of a cat and mouse détente, as it were, between government and tech? And that's really kind of exactly the way I feel. There are stories, maybe apocryphal from years back, of the government getting access to things like Western Union and stuff like that, and they'll get extra copies of telegrams. And certainly there's documented cases of the British doing that, pulling stuff off the cables. And there's always been that question of, does a company want to feel patriotic and help their country, and they kind of give these things on the side on an unofficial basis. If they want to do that, that's their choice. I have no problem with that. It's for a noble cause. Great. On the other hand, in these days, if they do it and it's found out, they're going to be crucified in the media, so they probably don't ever want to do that again, even privately under the table. But I think it should be a back and forth. I think the government has their needs. They do what they want to do. The private industry has their needs and their desires. They do what they want to do. If they want to help, fine, but they shouldn't be compelled to help. They shouldn't be compelled to do the government's job for them. But these are just my opinions. So. Anything else? All right, thank you very much.